speak, you'll understand their really unique perspectives and their backgrounds. And I think coming from them, it actually means a lot more and it'll be more rich. So let me start with introducing Yukon Regional Chief Adamek, who I was so impressed with. I have to say, I watched a TED talk that she did, and I'm just so excited she was able to join us. So Regional Chief, why don't you introduce yourself, maybe give a sense of your path to leadership, and also how resource development is important in your work.
Thank you so much, and so pleased to join you from the Ta'anquechan and Kwanlundan First Nation, so here in the Yukon. This is a photo of the territory that I call home, Kluane First Nation. So I'm a citizen of Kluane. I'm from the Daklawedi clan, Daklawedi Yohatuasauk, and my Tlingit name is Aagé. And I'm really honored to join all of you. Really important conversations, and really great that while we're in this wild rhythm together, there's still these moments where we can stay connected. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join you. So I currently serve as the AFN Yukon Regional Chief, and part of that responsibility includes the portfolio that I have to water through the environment and climate. But I mention water because Monday is World Water Day. And there's two other regional chiefs who also carry that file. But as we think about, water, we think about development, we think about lands and resources, right? Water is so critical. And I feel that water and land are often those parts of the conversation that can really be left out. So I really want to acknowledge all those who are continuing to do this work together. The work in terms of when we talk about development, one thing that always stands, very clear, from the Yukon region is, Indigenous peoples, specifically Yukon First Nations, seeking to be full partners. So what this really is about is if projects are going to happen, we really need to look at a rights-based approach. So let's take that, the right approach is a rights-based approach, and really work from there. So there has been a lot of really unique partnerships that have been created. There's a new encourage people to take a look, a First Nation procurement policy that is still going through a number of different changes here in the region, but certainly incredibly important. And so really do want to just flag a couple of those, I think, really unique pieces of who we are as it relates to Northerners, and looking forward to more of the conversation today.
Great, thank you so much. And I have been fortunate enough to spend some time up in Haines Junction, and you have a beautiful area of the world. And next, it's really my honor to introduce Mick Elliott, who comes from another very beautiful part of the world, closer to where I grew up in southern Saskatchewan, and one of actually my parents' very, very favorite places in the world. Mick comes from the Okanese Nation, but he also has worked in the energy sector. So he has a really interesting perspective and shared perspectives. Mick, why don't you share sort of your path to where you are and the uniqueness you bring to the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm a citizen of the Okanese Cree Nation here on Turtle Island, which is also known as North America. And I live here in Calgary in the Treaty 7 territories. And you're right, it's been an interesting journey. I will simply express too that my grandmother's a residential school survivor. She actually uplifted her entire family, married a white man, and left her communities to protect us from the impacts of residential school. And so that has really put me into this space of having this two-eyed seeing. I'm also two-spirited, which is LGBTQ2S. But it's really given me this two-eyed seeing vantage point. I'm actually a third-generation oil person, hydrocarbon person. My grandfather and my father both followed the hydrocarbon industry, which I've entered. And so my perspective coming into the space of energy is bringing that lens of Indigenous peoples and our values and our natural laws and our place of being stewards of Mother Earth, I'm bringing those voices to the boardroom tables that I interact with. So in my 20-year history, I worked with a number of companies, and I'll humbly say that I've become the first director in Exxon Mobil / Imperial, that's First Nations. So I kind of talked about a bit of the work that I've done. I've done impact benefit agreements. I've influenced how we engage on the land, how Indigenous voices and our knowledges are respected within applications and project development with proponents. I've had national oversight, coast to coast to coast, onshore, offshore, upstream, downstream, midstream. So really where I come at it is, we as Indigenous folks don't have an opportunity to really have that voice in these influence tables all that often. And I think it's really important to be in government and in big industries so that our voices are heard. Change happens best from within. And so that's kind of the role I've taken on. And it isn't without its obstacles, but we work around great people and in industries that really care about the Indigenous voice and are coming around change, part of the reconciliation and UNDRIP, FPIC. It's all really a big time of change.
Thanks so much, Mick, and thanks you for bringing up the Truth and Reconciliation. The results of that, which of course are highly connected to the residential school system that was in place in Canada. And I think through this conversation today, we are going to talk about, how resource development is part of reconciliation and how we engage in the context of resource development as part of reconciliation. And also what the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People means in terms of engaging for that. So Regional Chief, I wrote down a quote from your TED Talk, which talked about the gratitude for what the land gives you and leaving things better than they are found. And so, could you speak a little bit more about sort of the Indigenous relationship to the land, and also how traditional Indigenous knowledge can actually be used to inform resource development, and how that sort of connection to the land is important when we consider how we do resource development projects with Indigenous peoples.
I first I'm really excited to join you both, and as we were preparing, I know our respective teams preparing for this, I was also really thinking about what stories are going to be most relevant in terms of making the connection. And of course, we as Indigenous people, really all come from an oral history, oral historic background in terms of how we share information. And so I think I'll share a few stories. The first piece, I really think goes back to the values. So Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And I really think about, for Tlingit, from the Southeast and on the inland, Hakusti, it is who we are, part of the land, part of the water. The traditional laws of Dooley from more of a Southern Shoshone, for example, way of knowing and being. Those ways of knowing and being go back to, the creation story in terms of how we arrived, what that looked like. And one of the ways that I am able, I think, to help others understand when we talk about like worldview and connection and we are all one, the book Sawak is a great one by Umik Richard Atleo. But if we were to look at, a map and to see on a map, a particular parcel of land, from a Western colonial worldview, the questions may be, okay, so what is that land? What can that land, give us, right? Or what can we use it for? What is it going to provide to us? Is it going to be developed? Is there resource potential? Like, what does this look like? What's the long-term plan? Is there going to be infrastructure? Whereas from an Indigenous worldview, the land's role in this case could just be that, to just be, right? Its role is to just be in this context. And so this is where I really think it is about understanding of worldviews and, the land in terms of giving back to the land. I think about a recent experience that I had and going through, a hard moment. We especially in COVID, there's been a lot of hard moments. And a knowledge keeper, an elder that I'm quite close with, said, you just need to go on a walk. You need to go by the water. Like, if you can lay down some tobacco and just take pause. And, I do see kind of this, this kind of shift towards, and I'd say like this, very health and wellness kind of cultural shift towards like being mindful and expressing gratitude. But I do see a lot of synergies to like the worldviews that we have as Indigenous peoples, right? Like taking time to acknowledge, taking time to recognize. And I spoke about World Water Day, but if we don't have water, then we're not going to survive. If we don't have clean air, we're not going to survive. And so, the conversation can go on in terms of what it is that we need as both as human beings, but I think that also that differentiation between us and four-leggeds or two-winged or the ones that swim is that whole concept of we are all one. So we are not, superior to any animal or any other living creature on the earth. That is really, really important. And I know for some who this may be more new, some would say, well, that sounds really fluffy. And I've heard that. And there's moments where I'm like, okay, you can't take things personally, and it's not about being defensive, but it is about helping people understand that the impacts that are felt to the land are then felt by, of course, all those living beings, including us as human beings. And when we think about, and while the resource development, we know that there are really important projects that are being led and supported by Indigenous nations and rights holders, we also need to think about what that balance looks like. And so when we talk about climate, and that to me is really one of the most important things that we, as not only the generation I come from, but as leaders, as women, as men, as those who identify young people, we need to have those conversations, because I can tell you something. If you Google Kluane National Park, this lake behind me in the last 10 years has dropped about 10 feet. Like, that's real time. Because the glacier that feeds this lake, of course, has receded. And so this is what we're dealing with on the ground. And so while it is important that we look at what types of projects are going to be needed, to advance economies, to ensure that, the opportunities for future generations in terms of the resources, financial resources that are required, all of that is important. But if we don't have land, space, and place to do those projects in the next 50 years, then it's really interesting that we're having those conversations. So I go back to, again, that connection, that notion of, self being bigger than you as a human, right? It is really about the interconnectivity that exists. And I know it's a lot to unpack, but I really do feel like there's this really great moment for non-Indigenous peoples to take the time to learn a little bit more about worldview. And again, we're not all the same as Indigenous peoples. And I really appreciated, Mick, you sharing a little bit about, who you are and where you come from, because our languages, our protocols, our ceremonies are all very different. But there are some worldview pieces that do connect us all. And I think that is where we have a lot to share with the world. And I really look forward to the ongoing conversations about the importance, as you mentioned, Dr. McCormick, about the balance of traditional knowledge, right, and modern science, because we need to have the two. And I point to Sawak, and I'll share some more information about where you can find that book. But that's a really neat way of showing how, this kind of Western science and then traditional knowledge, and how the two really do have this really great opportunity to come together, to really share the true and real story of what it is that, you know, depending on what subject it may be, but what it is that you may be talking about. So I will take pause there because I'm really excited to hear from you, Mick. But yeah, those are some of the reflections that I hope are helpful for those who are participating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, you know, it's interesting for those that are on the line or are watching live or later on, you know, in Canada, about 5% of the Canadian population self-identifies as Indigenous, and 70% of those people are located within 100 kilometers of the resource projects that are underway. So, you know, Regional Chief Kluane Adamek talked about the spiritual connection, the cultural connection, the historical, traditional connections to land, as also, and also how their subsistence and their day-to-day life is affected by how the land is treated. But just even the geographical proximity, I think, is important to note. And then in Canada also, we have a duty to consult under our constitution, which is section 35. And so Mick, you know, jump in on sort of that, like the feeling and the connection to the land that you think your perspectives on that, but also, you know, maybe you could share your views on how consultations have evolved, somewhat pushed through the courts, but also somewhat pulled by progressive companies, and sort of share that story, because I think it's unique because of our constitutional requirement to consult, which is really important. But what that means has evolved over time.
Great. So the way I look at it and the way I communicate it is, if you're doing business on the land in Canada, you're doing business with Indigenous folks. And how well things go depends on how your relationship is with Indigenous folks who have this deep set connection to the land. And I simply state, this isn't speed dating. You know, you want to build formative relationships. You want to do that over time. You don't want to just do this one-hit wonder. And so, you know, there has been a very challenging relationship between the government and Indigenous folks. And so when a project comes home and comes into town, you know, there's a lot of kind of, who are these people coming into our areas? Because what you guys also have to remember is we have a static land base where our families have been for generations and will continue to be in the area for generations. So when the project's done or when the project's built, those people will remain and the history will also remain, and that connection is so strong. So as Indigenous peoples, we demand more of these project developers. We demand more, and that's what I would suggest has really evolved consultation, that requirement to freely inform us, consult with us, and make sure that we're engaged on all the project specifics. And we get really into the weeds on some of the details and understanding the geology, understanding the water consumption. All these types of elements are near and dear to our hearts. So lots of companies don't wait for policy changes. They lead the change, right? They see, okay, am I going to put my project at risk, or am I going to engage with these folks in a real meaningful way to make sure that the project evolves in a much better way? And I'm really proud about many of the industry partners in Canada, because I really think Canada has some of the best natural resource products that are socially responsible and considered, and environmentally high standards as compared to anywhere else in the world. And I connect that to Indigenous values. So, you know, some best practices: engage early and often. You know, when you're thinking about the project, you want to be talking with your friends, the Indigenous folks in the area. Be inclusive, don't be restrictive, be transparent. You want to look towards partnership, revenue sharing, different types of models to bridge that socioeconomic divide. You want to develop the workforce. You know, if the workforce is you want Indigenous folks to work with you, as per my previous statement. Develop scholarships, bursaries, contracting opportunities, and really get to know folks. You know, our elders and our knowledge keepers, you know, are just wonderful folks. And don't be afraid, you know, create that safe space, ask lots of questions. I guarantee you it will absolutely change your entire world. You know, it's I'm biased, of course, but yeah, it's great. Don't be afraid.
You know, it's so funny you say that. So early, inclusive, meaningful, and it doesn't seem that at all unrealistic, right? You know, the days of showing up with, this is what the project's going to look like, what do you think, are gone, right? It's about engaging, including from the beginning to the end when you look at the lifeline of a project, right? I think there's some projects in Canada that have set up really important advisory boards where the Indigenous people are included in the monitoring and the feedback and the ongoing operation of the project. Benefit sharing agreements are also really important. So I'm glad you mentioned those. And I think the media often shows this as conflict. The face of Indigenous engagement in resource projects has sometimes been about conflict. And you've seen, for example, in the US, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And I really love how I hope through the impact assessment work from the government side, but also these really progressive companies and Indigenous peoples that have been at the table in a constructive way, that it's really changing the conversation to how we all benefit and how there's increased certainty when you do engagement and you talk to people early in a meaningful way, and that everyone can benefit from these processes. Regional Chief, are there projects in or best practices that you can share or think about in terms of engagement and how proponents should be, what they should be thinking about when they start engaging with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate, you know, Mick, you mentioning like engaging early and often. So I think it's good to kind of parcel out like what it can't be. Like it can't be, oh, we're doing this project, we've submitted all the permitting and like this is going to be great. Oh, and then we want to work with you. We want to kind of hire some summer students and maybe offer you like a couple bursaries. Like that's not going to work, right? And to be really candid, like this is an opportunity to also look at leveraging the opportunity for you know, Indigenous peoples and rights holders to be you know, going beyond like being proponents of a project. Like this is about investing. This is about like the capital, and I know that this isn't the same for everyone, and I want to be really clear about that. But there are nations that have access to capital, and so this is also about looking at ways to bring in Indigenous nations as full partners in projects. So it goes beyond and recognizing that you know, the roles in terms of creating employment opportunities is really important. It's also really important to see the Indigenous peoples of that particular, the rights holders being engaged in senior decision-making roles within projects as well, or looking at ways in which Indigenous peoples can be part of the decision-making of the project. So I think this is where there's a long way to go. But in terms of best practices, like I you know, it's really important to understand, you know, the history of the relationship between, you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. You know, who are the people that you're going to be working with? What is their background? What is their experience? And you make a really good point, Mick. I too am an intergenerational survivor of residential school, and knowing like what some of that history might be within the community, the actual physical space and place of what had existed before, where is the project going to be located? There are some very important culturally relevant parts of territory that, and a lot of the time, right, projects are, they're just going to happen, and they don't necessarily go through and really understand, okay, that's someone's fish camp, that's someone's like berry picking patch that's been existing for like tens of thousands of years, maybe. I'm throwing it out there, but you know, it is understanding the community, understanding in terms of a rights-based approach. Are there currently agreements in place? I come from a region that has 11 self-government agreements. So this region has advanced self-determination in a very different way than you may see across the country, with nations being under the Indian Act, for example. So it is really about informing yourself and understanding who the nation is. What does it mean for them to be a nation? What does that look like? Then taking a look at the rights-based approach. So there's Section 35. Now we've got UNDRIP, which I think going to talk about a little bit, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is very specific about Indigenous peoples not just being included, but having full ability and authority to make decisions on their territories. So this is, I think, a really important opportunity for one to educate themselves, understand the lens, understand the lay of the land, so to speak, in terms of what other projects have been pre-existing, what worked and what didn't work before. So how can we learn from that? And I think it is building, and I think this is, and I, coming from a community that has quite a lot of resource potential in certain pockets, having those real authentic relationships, not having someone show up and like offer lunch and then leave, like that doesn't feel good, right? Like for anyone, for any of us, right? To go in and be like, here's lunch, okay, bye. So I think it really is about building relationships, as mentioned from Mick, engaging early and often, educating oneself about the community, and taking a deeper dive into the rights and the processes and what works for that particular community, so you can start to have a really genuine and authentic conversation, as opposed to it feeling like really uncomfortable and the nation feeling the pressure. There's nothing worse, right? I think as human beings, no one wants to feel pressured. So it's giving people all the information that they need so that they're able to come to the table to make decisions based on factual information that is readily accessible and available.
Thank you so Thank you so much. So Mick, if you anything you want to jump on in terms of what the regional chief mentioned, but also on sort of the international framework and international pressures that are coming. So whether it be the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, or also I would say the global investment pressures, whether through that ESG lens, and how, I think we have been focusing a lot on the E in terms of emissions and water, which are obviously really important in terms of local health and local access to clean air and clean water. But what that S element is really about community engagement, engagement with Indigenous peoples, and how that's done. So, your perspectives on those international pressures, both legally and sort of from a financial perspective, would be really great.
Yeah, so something that's actually really new and might not be familiar to a lot of Indigenous folks. I see folks here from Chile, to really empower yourself with the education that's out there. So right now what's coming down through the World Bank is Equator Principles, which are tied directly to UNDRIP. And so they're requiring anyone who funds projects over $50 million needs to adhere to the lending principles and is respectful of human rights, Indigenous rights, all falling within UNDRIP. So this is a really powerful new mechanism that banks are just starting to figure out now. So if you're an Indigenous person and you have one of those not so good folks operating in your area, understand who their lenders are and go talk to the banks. So this is talking to this world pressure coming down. So you've got UNDRIP hitting, you've got the banks kind of aligning with that to make sure that there's responsible lending that's going on. There's all sorts of legislation that's coming down. So, if some proponents aren't as good as others, I'll be completely honest. And depending on your region, Canada, I think, is really sophisticated. I would say New Zealand's more sophisticated as us, but we're like number 2 in the world as for Indigenous rights, in my experience. So, look to those guiding principles of what's going on in other areas to say, well, this is what's being done in the world. These are the legislations that are coming down. And Chief, becoming educated, we share the same degrees from SFU, MBA in Indigenous Business and Leadership. It's really about making sure you as Indigenous folks become educated not only about the operations around you, but about your rights, understanding the land, understanding your culture. What I'm really proud to find out and learn through this is, that merger, as you talked about, Chief, the merger between Western science and views and our traditional knowledges. Sustainability is a new buzzword, and there's lots of investment for that. And I would say Indigenous epistemological views are all about sustainability. A lot of the answers sit within our knowledge bases already. And so the world is waking up to that and is looking to invest in that. So instead of us trying to keep up with what's going on over the fence, we need to kind of seed in and press forward with a new way of thought and doing, which is actually our old ways, which is pretty kind of impressive.
Right.
that, all said, there's great things happening, but it really is important to be educated and understand. Without that education, this gap continues to spread apart. We need to close
Mhm.
that gap.
Mhm. No, that's, I think, really important. And I note how many times the word rights and awareness and meaningful have come up in all of these conversations. Um, Chief, maybe one last question for you, because I know we're coming to the end here. I think Indigenous relationships and Indigenous histories are not contained within political borders. Impacts to the environment is not contained within political borders. One of the projects that I have worked on in this field is the Arctic Wildlife Refuge and the impacts of development there on the Gwich'in people. And I think it's a really interesting example of how traditions and ways of life can be affected by resource projects. Maybe you could share a little bit about that, knowing it's in Yukon, and also just more generally, like how we might think about this from a cross-border perspective as we're advancing resource projects that will have impacts on both sides of the border in Canada and the US.
No, I'm really happy that you brought up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so for people who may not be aware, there was proposed development to take place within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, so the North Slope, which is like the north tip part of Alaska. And so the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. Now, the porcupine caribou herd, of course, no borders, right? So they travel, and it's really interesting if you look at a map of the Gwich'in communities between, Alaska, Yukon, and Northwest Territories. The Gwich'in communities are actually located in and around where the caribou travel, right? Because traditionally, as I understand, and I've been really grateful to have spent quite a lot of time, specifically in Old Crow with the Ventek Gwich'in, and just learning from the people about their deep connection to Vetsai, to caribou, and it is the livelihood. Like, and I can't stress this enough. I live in Whitehorse. I'm grateful that I've got some moose in my freezer from my dad, and I've got some salmon down there too. But on a daily basis, like I'm not eating traditional foods. I wish I was, but I'm not. When I go to Old Crow, everybody is always eating caribou, using caribou to some degree. They've got, from caribou hide to, the ways in which you can make tools with antlers, etc. Like the list goes on. But the point is, this is a livelihood issue. This is part of who the Ventek Gwich'in and the Gwich'in people are. They are caribou people. And so for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the calving grounds specifically that are located in and where, and I know there's been some shifts with this new administration, which is so great, but like at serious risk of this herd. And there was a point in time where the herd numbers had gone very, very low. And so there had been a whole bunch of really important advocacy that took place. And so the herd numbers are obviously now very strong. But the point is that the calving grounds, and I think that there's still a risk, there's still a risk because as administrations shift, the whole landscape of what is now can drastically change. I mean, we see that in Canada, right? A different federal government with different priorities and the ways that they view rights, as opposed to seeing rights as something that is required and it is a must and it is a legal tool. It's more like, is it a view of the season, right? Is it something that people want to look at or not really? That's what I think we need to get away from. It's like that alignment across parties, that alignment across the political places and spaces to say we have responsibilities here, and we need to take a rights-based approach. So the work that the Ventek Gwich'in and the Gwich'in Nation has done, it's remarkable, like the protection that they secured and continue to secure of their most critical and most important part of their livelihood. It's amazing. And we need, I think, as Northerners, we need people to understand that. It is the grocery store, right? It is the place where they teach the next generation who they are. And again, I do feel like to some degree, some people might see that as fluffy. I've heard that comment, as I shared before, but it's real and it is very different. And so it's also us being open to kind of taking off the lenses for a minute, to really understand what it means for another people's to have their whole world put upside down. And I think COVID, if anything, has taught us that we need to be more compassionate. We need to have more empathy. We need to be able to get uncomfortable and have hard conversations in order to come up with the best solutions. And so I hope that you know the Gwich'in continue to get the support that they need to keep their most sacred resource, one of which is what's to keep that protected for future generations.
Thank you. I think it's such a concrete and important example about that spiritual and subsistence connection to the land that can be affected by development. And I also have been very fortunate to work with many leaders, many female leaders from Old Crow who came down to Washington, D.C. time after time to advocate. And we were very happy to host at the embassy and work with them in terms of making sure people are aware of what the risks are to their being in many ways. And I think you get back to that word of rights very quickly when you talk about this. Mick, last question for you. You sit at lots of tables talking to communities, and you talking to and representing industry, talking to Indigenous peoples. There's probably a lot of people that will watch this that are just learning about, like, so how do you learn? How do you learn about history? A lot of what we talked about today was about education and awareness, and what's the best mindset to come to a table with, and what are the things that make the discussions at a table go well, in your experience?
It's being inquisitive. So whenever I prepare anyone who hasn't been into Indigenous community before, I run them through an awareness session that talks about basic principles and understand that Indigenous communities, we're not homogenous. It varies from one to the next, right? So you need to understand and like Chief said, do a little bit of the education, do a little bit of the homework, and just create a bit of a safe space. If you're not Indigenous, it can be really intimidating, and sometimes our folks can bang their fist on the table and be all upset. Understand with some compassion that there's been some real challenging times in our history, and that frustration might come through. And instead of taking it personally, listen to the message and understand what it might be like for us. Put that moccasin on and understand what that worldview is, right? One shoe, one moccasin. And I think that's really important. And when you come in and you actually are curious and you're open to asking questions, and I always say, sit next to an elder and ask lots of questions, right? Because, once you start building that foundation of relationship and talk about your family and where you're from and do you have dogs, or, it really starts to kind of build that relationship, because we want to know as Indigenous people who you are. We're not looking, like I said, speed dating, or just showing up for coffee. We want to have a relationship with you like we have with most other things in land. So I think if you're new to the space, my contact details are here, reach out, contact me. But at the end of the day, do a bit of that homework, like Chief said, come into those meetings, be prepared to show up when you don't need something as well, right? Just show up to have coffee. Those kitchen table conversations are probably the best you'll ever have. But when you're in boardrooms, as an Indigenous person, I get intimidated sometimes still, because all around the table are usually, quite frankly, white men of an older age, right? And so in comes this brown person, and you're listening, and so I've gotten to the point too is trust yourself too, and trust your knowledge, and trust what our ancestors have gifted to us in knowledge, and use your voice, right? So Chief, I feel it from you, and I'm getting tinglies right now. But we have to be able to feel or press through that intimidation and make sure our voices are heard. So at these boardroom tables, if something's being said that's amiss, I'll say that's not okay. You know, break those glass ceilings, right? Break through those barriers. I've sat around government tables, and everyone's really curious to hear what we have to say. So don't be intimidated about that. It's sharing, and don't square off that round that peg to make it fit into that round hole, or round it off. Sorry. You know. So at the end of the day, just be open. Seed into the space and be yourself, and don't be afraid of opening up, and it'll open many doors of opportunities.
And being okay with making mistakes sometimes, right?
Yes.
And learning.
I've been yelled at so much.
Right? If you're not
Yes.
making mistakes, you're probably not trying hard enough, or you're not learning. Chief, any last words from you before we close?
I'm really grateful. These are the types of conversations, right, that we need to be having more of. So I really want to acknowledge you and the consulate for putting this together. You know, I know that there are different you know, legislative frameworks that exist for Indigenous peoples in the US and, you know, versus Canada. At the same time, I think that all of the principles can really still apply as it relates to Indigenous peoples around the world. So engage early and often, understand the landscape, be able to, you know, create the relationship. That's really important. And I really look forward to future conversations, and yeah, protect the sacred is the hashtag if you want to join in on protecting of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so thank you as well, again, Dr. McCormick, for the opportunity, and Mick, it's so great to, you know, we see each other's kind of, you know, the names, but when you're able to make that connection face to face, it's really great and special. So thank you.
Well, thank you both, Matthew Cho. I really appreciate this, and I hope we can keep bringing this conversation to the South Central United States, where you know, the majority of U.S. tribes are located, and a lot of the energy is located, so, and lots of Canadian companies too. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to work together. Thank you all, and thank you for everyone that has listened in. Have a great day, and stay safe, everyone.
Hi, everyone.